Hello, I am Patrice from the Parenting Center along with my colleague Monet, and today we are presenting a presentation on trauma and education. Again, I'm Patrice. I have a background in education. Monet, would you like to introduce yourself, ma'am?
Thank you and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I am Monet Somerville. I have a background in psychology, focusing on trauma and how it impacts development.
Thanks, Monet. Today is all about trauma and how teachers can help students who may have a traumatic experience in their classrooms. So the focus today is to learn about trauma, the types of trauma and the signs of trauma, and learn how to help students in your classroom who may have experienced some form of trauma. Many of you are familiar with how Zoom works, but here are the engagement tools. At some point, we may ask you to give us a thumbs up. We also ask that you keep your videos on at all time, but if you need to do something, if you're distracted and need to step away, please stop your video because it often can be distracting to everyone else. If you need to say something in the chat, make sure you have your option on everyone, and we will recognize and recognize you if you raise your hand in the area where participants are located. I'm going to now turn it over to Monet, who will talk to us about trauma.
So what is trauma? As a psychologist, we look at trauma as actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And this definition is very much focused on the perception. So one person may experience an event and another person may experience the exact same event, but they respond to it differently. So one person may see it as traumatic and another person just may see it as a negative life event. And what's really important to understand about trauma is that not all negative life events are traumatic. So we have three main types of trauma. The first type is acute trauma, and this is just a single event trauma, and this could be something like Hurricane Katrina. The other type of trauma is chronic trauma, and this is repeated or prolonged traumatic events. So something like a war would be traumatic. The idea of a complex trauma, though, is similar to chronic because it's repeated and prolonged, but it's also relationship based. So if you think about a physical abuse situation, that occurs over a long period of time, or it can occur over a long period of time, and it's within the context of a parent-child relationship. And people can experience multiple traumas at once. So you can experience a chronic trauma such as a war or a pandemic event that we're going through now, and also experience maybe a complex trauma like you're getting verbally abused. So what does trauma really do for our bodies? So what trauma does is it activates our stress system in our brains and our bodies. And our stress system begins with a brain region called the amygdala. And this is our fight, flight, or freeze zone. And that signals our sympathetic nervous system, which increases our blood pressure and increases heart rate, dilates our pupils, and that all of that actually is done through the excitatory neurotransmitters. And our excitatory neurotransmitters that we may all be familiar with is adrenaline. And what that does is it helps us to get away from things that are dangerous or that could cause harm to us. But when the danger is actually gone, a whole nother system in our bodies becomes activated. Our parasympathetic nervous system becomes activated, and our inhibitory neurotransmitters like serotonin become activated to bring the body and the brain back to normal. But when you have a trauma, especially a prolonged trauma or a complex trauma that's relationship based, what it does is it continuously activates the stress system, so your body is not able to come down. So the sympathetic nervous system, that adrenaline rush, those excitatory neurotransmitters are constantly going, and there's no activation of that inhibitory system to bring everything back down. So there are some early risk factors for trauma that we may not have ever thought about. Pre and postnatal factors. So a difficult pregnancy, that could just be mom had some medical issues going on with her during her pregnancy, which made her be more stressed out, which went directly to the baby. So when mom's stress hormones are high, that goes to the baby. The other thing is, maybe there was alcohol or drug abuse during the pregnancy, or mom was just consistently stressed out over different things. Maybe she had more children at home that she had to care for on her own. There could have been a number of different things that happened. A difficult birth, again, that releases more stress hormones by mom, which goes directly to the baby. And then early hospitalizations. And what we've learned in the attachment theory is that healthy touch early on from day one is really, really protective against a lot of negative things that can occur in life. But when you have an early hospitalization, these children typically are not able to have that healthy touch. They get hurtful touch with needles and being poked and prodded with different tests that need to be done, or life-saving um, life-saving procedures that have to be done. Those kind of things are very, very helpful, but they're also very traumatizing. And then classically, abuse, neglect, and other forms of trauma that can occur early on. So when we think of trauma and we think of different events, what we typically look at are type of trauma, duration, the identity of the perpetrator, age at the time of the event, and toxic stress. And these things can actually either increase the likelihood that a trauma response will be developed, or we'll see less likelihood. So the type of trauma, when we're looking at those three types that we talked about earlier, the single event, the complex, and the chronic. Chronic and complex traumas are typically the most impactful types of trauma. And between chronic and complex, complex is the worst, because that actually functions within the relationship aspect. And a relationship is essentially what we need as human beings to be able to function properly in life. And what happens is when we have a complex trauma, the person's ability to develop and maintain healthy relationships is impacted. So therefore, they may not want to reach out for help, or they may not trust people enough to reach out for help. When we look at the duration, a shorter trauma, such as a single event trauma, is less impactful than a long-term trauma, because that long-term trauma activates that stress system for a longer period of time. Identity of the perpetrator, again, that goes back to simply that relationship piece. If I know this person who's supposed to take care of me and they are hurting me, that can lead to a lot of issues in brain development. Age at the time of the event. So we found that there is a negative relationship between age at the time of the event and negative impacts of trauma. So what that means simply is that the younger you are, the more impactful a traumatic event can be. And then chronic stress. Toxic stress. Toxic stress is essentially just as harmful as trauma, because it still activates that stress system continuously. So to go on to the signs of trauma, there are 6 categories that we typically look at for trauma signs. But what is very, very important is that just because you see some of these things does not necessarily mean that there's a traumatic event. There are a lot of other variables that can come into play, such as developmental stage or personality traits. But if the issue is sudden, different from what seems to be normal, or intensifies, there may be an issue with trauma, but not necessarily. So let's dive into the attachment signs of trauma. So when we see this, we look at lack of social skills. This is seen a lot in complex traumas because of the negative implications that a child learns about relationships. They learn that there are no safe people around to help them, so they don't develop those social skills. Trouble seeking help. Again, going back to that relationship, there are no safe people, therefore I can't ask people for help. and being controlling or permissive. When we look at this, the idea here is that if I'm in control, then no one can hurt me. Or if I'm never seen, then I can't be hurt. And those are simply protective measures for the person. Physical signs of trauma, we see problems with eating, and that could be eating too much, too little, not eating at all, or even having some bulimic type behaviors of binging and purging. When we look at sleeping issues, we're looking at, are they sleeping too much or too little? Are they having problems falling asleep or staying asleep? And then we can see sensory motor issues. Sensory motor could be that you're seeing them seek certain sensory things versus avoiding certain sensory things. So sensory seeking behaviors could be a child that's spinning, or they randomly are screaming, or they are running into things purposefully because their bodies are needing that sensory input at that moment. Sensory avoidance could be closing their eyes, closing their ears, just because something is reminding them of that trauma, and to prevent that, they're trying to limit the amount of sensory input. Somatic complaints are physical complaints with no medical basis. So they could have muscle pain, they could have stomach issues, but there's nothing physically going on to cause that. And then increased medical issues. A lot of times we will see children who have an increase in cold, so they're not coming to school as often, and they may be diagnosed with more issues like asthma. So when we move on to affect regulation is simply our mood. How do we control our moods? And one way that we see that there's an issue with children who have experienced a traumatic event is that they have problems communicating their needs. I can't trust anyone to help me manage my mood. They may also have a constricted mood. And usually when we say constricted mood, it's a limited amount of change in mood. So you may have a child that's really happy, and then they can be sad, and then they can be happy again. Well, with trauma children, typically they are in a negative cycle of negative moods. So they're either sad, they're angry, they may be anxious, and that's just their world, and that's the only emotions that they really display. When we look at behavior, we have poor impulse control. And this can look like a child getting up and down out of their seat at school, or repeatedly talking out of turn. We can see aggression, and that could just be that child hitting others or damaging property. And then pathological self-soothing techniques. So a lot of times what we'll see is that we'll see children who do self-inflicting harm, like they'll take different items and scratch themselves. For older children, we may see cutting or drug use or alcohol abuse. And it's just a way to soothe themselves because of the trauma that they have experienced. When we look at the next two sets of trauma signs, cognition. And one of the ones that I wanted to point out is difficulty concentrating, because this is a lot of what we see with ADHD children. And they may not be ADHD, it's just that their brains cannot focus because of the traumatic events that they've experienced. Problems with processing information. This can be where you're asking a child a question and it takes them an extended period of time to answer that question, or they're not able to learn the new material as quickly as other students in the class. We may also see developmental delays and regressions. And simply, one of the most common examples is going to the bathroom. And, at one point, this 6-year-old may have been able to go to the bathroom regularly and not have accidents. And now all of a sudden we're seeing them have 2 and 3 accidents a day. They're not communicating when they need to go to the bathroom. Finally, self-concept. So when we look at children, having low self-esteem is a huge thing. And self-esteem develops from those early relationships. So when you have a positive relationship and you don't have that traumatic experience, then you're more likely to have higher self-esteem. But when you do experience trauma, especially trauma within the context of a relationship, low self-esteem is very, very common. Also, if we think about the psychosocial development and think about that shame and guilt, that's more likely to occur with children who have experienced trauma. Again, a lot of these signs of trauma are very, very common in most children, but it's not necessarily saying that, oh, this child has shame, so therefore they're traumatized. That's not what this is saying. There are a lot of other variables that need to be taken into context when considering this. Ms. Patrice?
Thanks, Monet. That was great information about trauma and types of trauma. So at this time, I'd like you to stop and just reflect for a moment. How do you think trauma has shown up in your class? I'll just give you a couple of seconds to think about that. How do you think trauma has shown up in your class? And the reason I want you to reflect on that question, because the next part of our presentation has to do with what are some things you can do as a teacher to help. But knowing now what you know about trauma based on what Monet has shared with you, you may be at a point now where you're saying, this particular child has done this, I wonder, or this particular child has done that. I wonder if that could be the result of a traumatic experience. Next slide, please. So I want to remind you that trauma can interfere with brain development, learning, and behavior. And as educators, it's our goal to make sure we create a warm, loving environment designed to help every child flourish academically, whether it's a child with a traumatic background or not. When we walk into classrooms every day, that is our goal. So how can teachers help? I'm going to go through a series of 6 steps, and we're going to talk a little bit about what you, an educator, can do to help with the child, or help a child who may have come from a traumatic background. And the first thing is build a relationship. Children who experience trauma are not as trusting of peers or teachers. So that may be it may be difficult for you to build trust because they don't normally trust so easily. So the building of the relationship is really key. You want to pour as much positive into the child as you can and encourage others to do so. So if you're working with other members of the team at your school, you can possibly say to the disciplinarian, hey, there's a student in my class who's having some troubles at this time. When you see him or her, can you say something positive to him or her? The same with coaches. You want others to pour just as much positivity into the child as you can. And the reason is you want to avoid causing any re-traumatization. Not knowing what all the signs are initially and having to delve more into learning more about this kid, it might be in your best interest as you're building relationships to just continue with that positivity and make sure that you're not doing anything to re-traumatize. The second one is to ask questions, right? You want to be at a point where you start to ask very specific questions when you see specific behaviors like poor impulse control and aggression consistently show up in the classroom, right? You want to be able to go to the social workers. The social workers may be a little bit more familiar with this child, his or her family, and be able to say to you, yes, I know that family, and here are some things that are going on. You might be able to talk to other teachers. There may be a teacher right up the hall who has this family or who knows this family because there's been an aunt or a cousin that's from that same family that understands. Administrators and parents, and you notice here I have parents last, because if there's information in the school about that particular child, then it's our responsibility as educators to hunt that information down within our framework or within our building before we go to parents, because we definitely don't want parents to have to talk about something again that they've already shared with the school. And consider composing a list of questions, up to 3, that can be used school-wide. So what are some questions you can ask as a school that is not too where you're not imposing on the family too much. And the reason I say a school-wide list of questions, because one teacher shouldn't have one list of questions and another teacher should have another list of questions. What are some questions you can ask that will get more information for you, but that's not in any way offensive? The third one is to keep the data. You know that data drives instruction, but also data is something that you need to be able to track behaviors. So you want to be able to include the time so that you can establish a pattern or a trend. For example, if you're teaching at you're somewhere near the board or you have a clipboard, you can say a particular student on January 4th at 10:55, the A stands for aggression, right? And then impulse control. Same day at 1:45 p.m. The reason you want to write this information down is because you want to establish what is the pattern, what behaviors am I seeing consistently? And the only way that you can do that is if you write it down. Now, this is just a quick way to write it down, but then later on you need to go back and be specific as to what exactly happened. What are the details? You want to think more specific than broad. Not just that this child displayed aggression, but what happened to show the aggression. You also want to use resources, again, your social worker, interventionist, disciplinarian, resource teachers to assist. So when this child is in different areas or with different individuals in the school, you want to ask them, when he or she was with you, did any of this happen? And if so, moving forward, can you please start to record it so that our data can pretty much be consistent on some of the things that you see that I've seen as well. And the data will be used to share with parents or a committee to devise strategies. You don't want to just sit in a meeting unprepared and say, on this particular day, he was aggressive. On this particular day, he was impulsive. You may have the date, which is specific information, but what was the behavior? And also having information from other teachers or other individuals on the school campus will help show that there's a pattern. So now that you know what the behaviors are, what can you do to correct them? The fourth step has to do with effectively communicating. When specific behaviors show up, communicate what needs to happen as calmly as possible. Walking right over to the student and saying, I need you to sit in your chair. You're not loud. You're in the same teaching voice as you had as you're presenting your lesson. You're not creating a problem. But if that doesn't happen, you need to come up with what are the next steps that's going to happen if this child does not do as he or she has been instructed to do. But if he does, then maybe you can revisit the situation later privately by saying, hey, I want to thank you for listening when I asked you to sit or when I instructed you to sit in your chair. I really appreciate that. But be prepared, because there may be a chance that you say quietly, I need you to sit in your chair, but that doesn't happen. What is your next step? When talking to parents, effectively communicate by saying things like, today Johnny became extremely aggressive when a friend didn't give him the ball at recess, so he pushed the child down, right? So again, there is your communication side of it, being able to tell exactly what happened. And then know the school's discipline policy and how it relates to students who have experienced trauma. I know that there are some schools are implementing a particular curriculum that has to do with traumatic experiences in kids, and the discipline policy for students who have experienced some form of trauma is slightly different from your regular or your normal students who may not have experienced some form of trauma. So know what that policy is, because you don't want one set of rules for one group and then another set of rules for another group without there being a policy in place. And then you want to discuss with the parents ways that consequences for inappropriate behavior can be the same both at home and at school. The only way that this can happen is if you communicate. Mom, what happens at home when Johnny does this? And then you're able to share what you do at school so that the child is not confused about what the consequences are when he's 1 at home or 2 at school. Coming together to be on the same page will make it easier for the child to be successful and to turn around those inappropriate behaviors. The fifth thing is spread the love evenly. It can be difficult spreading love to a student who often misbehaves, but there has to be opportunities for a redo. You don't want to be in a position of having the child where there's an inappropriate behavior, but then you show as an adult that you're upset about that 3 hours later. If greeting every child with a high five is part of your daily routine, continue doing so even if an appropriate and inappropriate behavior occurred right before the greeting. So say your students are walking down the hall to enter the classroom. You see the student do something inappropriately. You correct it, but then you get to your door and you turn around. Everybody gets a high five, including that student. You do not want to take out what has happened down the hall and have it interfere with what your normal procedures are. Because remember, the building of the relationship, because traumatic students or children from a traumatic background do not trust easily. You have to continue providing and pouring into that child. And remember, you're building a relationship and the issue is the behavior, not the child. I'm going to repeat that. The issue is with the behavior, not the child. So all of these steps that you're taking and all of these strategies that are being shared is to address the behavior and to hopefully turn this thing around. And then as an educator, you want to model, communicate out loud and name the emotion or feeling you're having when you're upset about something. An example is, today was a really tough day for me because I didn't get to bed until 1 a.m. I'm feeling irritated. If your students are young and may not know what that word is, talk a little bit more to increase their vocabulary around what irritated looks like so they can recognize it. And then you come back with something like, I will rest well tonight and do better tomorrow. I'm sorry I'm not giving my best today. What you're doing is modeling when you're experiencing an emotion, how to address it so that when your students, either from a traumatic background or not, is having an emotion, it shows them that that can be modeled and that it can be handled in an appropriate way. And you also want to do the same when you're excited or happy about something. Good morning, everybody. I'm full of excitement today because I passed my test last night. If you're a student or any other example that provides some level of excitement in your life, share it. Share it with your students. And if possible, build in a time during the day to allow students to share their feelings. Everybody doesn't have to share because you don't always have an emotion every day, but there are some that may, and it gives them a chance to be able to put that emotion out there. It can be called something like an expression hour, expression hour, or what you're feeling, or a mood moment. So those 6 strategies are things that you can do as teachers to help your students from a traumatic background. But guess what? These same steps can be taken if the behavior is not the main concern. It can be a need for attention because of an abandonment situation. So you want to do the same thing. Model, communicate, keep your data. These strategies, again, don't always have to apply to students from traumatic background. Once you get into the habit of doing this, I think it will make the culture of your classroom a good culture overall. So now that you've heard all this information about trauma and what you can do as a teacher to help your students from a traumatic background, what can you do differently tomorrow, taking into consideration what you've learned about trauma today? Now that's a biggie, because you might start tomorrow with a high five, or making sure you're communicating effectively, or making sure that you're sharing your emotions. Whatever that is, I want you to stop, possibly even write down what's one of the 6 things that I've talked about you can do starting tomorrow in your classroom. Now that you have it written down, we're going to move on. So as an individual teacher, team of teachers, committee, or school, what can you do as next steps? You can learn ways to successfully address students with trauma in schools. This doesn't have to be something that you go say, oh my gosh, we have to do this, we have to do this. You could be the one person on your campus that takes the initiative, or you can work with your partner teacher. What are some ways that you guys can come up with to successfully address it? Look for curricula that may be trauma-informed approaches or practices. How can you use something that's currently out there, or with the help of another teacher, your school leader? What curricula may be out there that can address some of the trauma-informed practice, or that you can use as trauma-informed practices on your campus? And then you want to learn more about creating a safe culture in schools for students with trauma. But remember, initially we talked about the goal is to create a warm and loving environment for all kids. But if you have kids that may be from a traumatic background, you also have to start with creating a safe culture for them, because that's going to look slightly different than creating a safe culture for kids who may not have experienced trauma. And then I'll let Monet share with you a little bit about this article.
So this is a link to an article about trauma-informed classrooms and how to create a trauma-informed classroom. It's a very easy read, and I think it can give some really concrete ideas about what teachers can do just to change that classroom environment for a child that's experienced trauma.
So at this time, Monet is going to close us out. Thank you, and I am hopeful the information that has been presented will help you in your learning environment, or help you with the facilitation of learning in the learning environment that you're responsible for.
So today our objectives were to learn about trauma, the types of trauma and signs of trauma, as well as learn how to help students in their classroom who may have experienced some form of trauma, and we hope that we have actually met those objectives for today for you. If you have any questions that come up, please contact us. Our number is on the screen, 504-896-9591, or you can easily email us. Both of our email addresses are at the bottom of the screen, or you can email us at chparenting, PARENTING, at lcmchealth.org. Thank you again for watching.